Imagine a king, crowned in a blaze of glory, yet doomed by his own treacherous heart. Richard II, a name that echoes through history as both villain and enigma, seized the English throne in a whirlwind of fate and tragedy. His story begins not in England, but in the sun-drenched port of Bordeaux, France, in 1367. Born to Edward the Black Prince and Joan, Countess of Kent, Richard of Bordeaux was never meant to rule, but destiny had other plans. Tall, strikingly handsome, and sharp as a blade, Richard stood 6 feet tall, his presence commanding awe. Yet, beneath the charm lurked a flaw. When rage or fear gripped him, his words faltered into a stammer, betraying the cracks in his regal facade. Intelligent and well-read, he was no fool until madness claimed him in the end. His path to power was paved with sorrow. Richard wasn't the son of a king, but of a prince who never wore the crown. As the youngest son, his claim was a distant dream. Then, tragedy struck. At 4 years old, Richard watched his older brother Edward succumb to the bubonic plague at just 6. The loss shattered his father, already weakened by dysentery, who soon followed his son to the grave. By 10, Richard was no longer just a boy, he was King of England. His coronation was a spectacle to rival legends. For 2 days, London drowned in celebration. Fountains spilled wine, streets pulsed with parades, and the city gifted castles to its people in a display of opulence. But behind the pageantry, a darker truth festered. Richard's reign would be no fairy tale. His crown, won through loss, would lead to a brutal end, one sealed by a promise made and savagely broken by Henry von Porth. The massive temporary structure stood in the center of London, and 4 maidens stood in its 4 towers, showering the young Richard with gold as he marched by for the ceremony. When he was just 14, he faced his first real test as king. In 1381, the infamous Peasants' Revolt erupted after the king raised the country's taxes. Groups of men blocked, mobbed, and burned down key sites all over the capital. It was pandemonium. But not for Richard. He was hiding out in the Tower of London. Eventually, he realized that if he wanted to hold on to his crown, he had to assert himself. On June 13th, he set out on the River Thames to meet the rebels and negotiate. Richard helped disband the Peasants' Revolt by granting clemency to the rebels, only to quickly revoke the order. Then he did one better and went out on the battlefield himself to personally squash any of the stragglers. Being a king with vast resources, he was terrifyingly successful, and it had devastating consequences for the rest of his reign. The Peasants' Revolt baptized Richard II in blood, and he never forgot the dark lessons he learned over those few formative days. As he aged, he started to guard his crown ever more jealously, eventually becoming a staunch defender of his absolute power. At the height of his reign, Richard corrupted himself to cartoon villain proportions. Convinced that he was God's chosen one, the king became notorious for how bad he was at interacting with commoners. He was incredibly susceptible to flattery and spent most of his reign insulating himself in his court with his various favorites. Although he was ruinously vain, some historians believe there were even darker forces at play during Richard's ill-fated reign. Some historians have gone so far as to claim that he had schizophrenia, while the most recent work suggests he suffered from a narcissistic personality disorder. Richard II's focus on arts and culture did have some upshots. English was developing as a literary language during this time, and Richard's refined court did a lot to help it along. In fact, the father of English literature, Geoffrey Chaucer, worked in the king's court early in his career, and his writing paved the way for other titans like William Shakespeare. Richard didn't just enjoy paintings of himself. He was also a fan of gaudy jewelry and textiles, and spent massive amounts of money on baubles to adorn both himself and his loved ones. Though history has consumed many of these items, one of the most breathtaking achievements of Gothic jewelry, Queen Anne's crown, is still around today. Richard was a growing king, which meant he needed a queen. His eye fell on Anne of Bohemia, whose pedigree was as good or even better than his own. Her father was Charles IV, also known as the Holy Roman Emperor. Their union might have looked like a political match from the outside, but the truth was much different. Everyone hated the idea of Richard and Anne becoming a couple, except Richard and Anne. Anne brought no dowry to England, but the king only wanted her anyway. In fact, he had to pay her family for the privilege of marrying her. They were both 15 years old, and they married at Westminster Abbey on January 20th, 1382. In 1387, Richard II's reign really started to fall apart at the seams when a faction of Parliament called the Lords Appellant finally managed to oust all his favorite courtiers from power. But Richard had been playing the Game of Thrones since he was 10, and he eventually regained control, then dealt them a brutal revenge. After resecuring his power, Richard tracked down almost every last one of his enemies and executed them. But he wasn't finished yet. In an ultimate bad guy move, he then went out into the countryside and executed any of the common people who had supported the lords. Thus began a new age, Richard's tyranny. Although they never had any children, Richard and Anne shared a blissful 12 years together, and many historians believe she was as good for his reign as she was for his heart. She made him more compassionate and moderated his violent tendencies in matters of state, and he repaid her with almost complete devotion until the day it all came crashing down. In 1394, an old enemy of Richard II came knocking. That year, his beloved wife, Anne, fell ill with the bubonic plague, the same disease that had killed Richard's brother and weakened his father. Soon after contracting the illness, Anne died at her home in Sheen Manor. Richard was so devastated and grief-stricken that he even had Sheen Manor demolished so that he'd never have to look at it again. For the rest of his reign, he was irrational and increasingly cruel. He wasn't above taking out his personal frustrations on his political life. While traveling to Scotland on a campaign, he got the heartbreaking news that his mother had passed. Richard's reaction redefined unhinged. Perhaps venting his feelings, he let his men loose on Edinburgh. And together, they nearly destroyed the city. Through with the ravages of love, he decided to orchestrate a strictly political marriage with the French princess Isabella of Valois instead. Sounds fairly normal until you learn that Isabella was 6 years old at the time of their engagement. Richard was 29. Surprisingly, marrying a virtual toddler was frowned upon, even in medieval England. But when his advisors brought up that issue, Richard didn't seem to care. He flippantly responded that each day would make the problem go away. Richard made a fatal error when he took vengeance on the Lords Appellant. He let a precious handful of members live, including his cousin Henry Bolingbroke. If that name sounds familiar, that's probably because he's the man who would soon violently overthrow Richard and become King Henry IV. But it's how Henry did it that's gone down in infamy. Richard II had been the big man on campus for decades. But even he recognized that Henry Bolingbroke was a threat. Henry's royal blood saved him from execution in the Purge. But Richard went further than that. To placate him, Richard made Henry a duke. Richard made another catastrophic miscalculation around this time. He said he didn't care that his wife Isabella was a child, but he should have. Richard was still childless at the time of his second wedding, and Isabella wasn't about to be of childbearing age anytime soon. This lack of an heir made him even more vulnerable to the coup on the horizon. In the end, Richard might have escaped with his crown and his life if it weren't for his panicked decisions. Henry Bolingbroke wasn't willing to make any moves on the throne until Richard dealt him a blow. First, he had Henry exiled. Then, when Henry came into an inheritance, Richard seized all his properties and extended his exile in a bid for control. Whereas Richard II's ancestors were mighty warrior kings, he took a much different approach. Instead of spending most of his time fighting with his men, he built up his own private army to do his bidding without needing to lift a finger himself. This helped shape him into our modern image of a distant king sat in the center of a lavish court, but it also led to his downfall. Eventually, Henry Bolingbroke forced his way back into England to claim his inheritance. He couldn't have chosen a more perfect time. Richard was away in Ireland along with most of the nobles loyal to him. As a result, Henry sailed on through, gathering supporters as he went. By this time, Richard was incredibly unpopular, and a day of reckoning was coming. Although people kept telling him he should stage a coup, Henry at first swore that he only wanted his money, not the crown. It was Richard who changed everything. With his distaste for battle, Richard surrendered to his cousin almost immediately after his return and desperately offered Henry the crown in exchange for his life. Following this transfer of power, Henry imprisoned Richard in the Tower of London. Richard regretted his actions almost immediately, launching into a tantrum and demanding his crown. On October 13, 1399, Henry officially snatched the hollow crown from Richard II, becoming King Henry IV, and then he dealt the final blow. Although Henry had originally promised to spare Richard's life, he quickly realized it was too dangerous to have a former king hanging around. He knew he had to take care of Richard, but the way he did it was beyond cruel. Instead of a regular beheading or even a common hanging, Henry gave Richard a much more torturous end. Little by little, day by day, he starved Richard to death from his cell until the former king succumbed. Then, on February 17th, Henry showed off the fruits of his dark labors, displaying Richard's cold, emaciated corpse in St. Paul's Cathedral for all to see. Whether out of guilt or expediency, Henry buried Richard hastily and without fanfare in King's Langley Priory. Eventually, though, Richard got something of a happy ending. More than a decade later, Henry's successor said sorry and entombed Richard at Westminster Abbey alongside his beloved Queen Anne,